Welcome, welcome, welcome to Equity is Not an Add-on. I have presented on a panel with these amazing people more than once for a bunch of different things, and I'm very, very honored to sit on the panel with them again to speak about equity. So before we get started, let's go through some announcements. Who am I? I'm Dr. Desiree Alexander, and I am on camera today. Hello. I am the founder, CEO of Educator Alexander Consulting, and I'm the host of the webinar. So these are all of the different ways you can contact me. Yay! If you're watching us on the YouTube channel, no, you don't get a certificate, but you do get the knowledge. So yay you. And you can look in the description right underneath the video to get the resources for this webinar. What do we have coming up? On October 2nd, we have Infusing Digital Reading and Writing Tools, no matter how you teach, remotely, blended, or face-to-face with Dr. Hines. We have Creating Engaging and Interactive Lessons with Nearpod on October 9th, and then we switch it up with Using Seesaw for Ditch, Sit, and Reflection on October 23rd. Bunch of good things coming in October. Then hopefully we are in person in Houston, Texas at the TCCA, completely free conference. It is always one of my favorite conferences. So last year we were virtual and it was still on and popping. So hopefully we're back in person this time and we can have a lot of fun. Then on December 4th, we have the Google Educator Certifications panel. So if you're ever like, I want to be a trainer or an innovator or a coach, come find out not only how to do it, but how to make it successful for you. So even if you're like, I am an innovator, but I'm not really into the community, come find out how to get yourself more connected and things like that. So if you know any of the people on this panel, it will not be a boring panel. It's going to be very, very interesting. And I don't know why it's just an hour. We probably needed 2 hours for this one, but there you go. And that's going to be December 4th. And it's going to be a lot and great. So speaking of panels, today we have just like, you know how words kind of fail you? I hate to say like an amazing panel, because they're over amazing. They just really are. So they are going to introduce themselves. So I'm not going to, get tongue tied and praising them really. So let's do what we came here for. We're going to go ahead and get started with equity is not an add-on. So welcome to the Equity is Not an Add-on panel. I'm going to call on each one of the panelists to please introduce themselves, and then we're going to get into some content. So we're going to start with Ike. Ike, can you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you on a Saturday. I already know this is an awesome group for taking the time out of your day to show up on a Saturday and truly just learn alongside us, because this is when we start talking about equity and social justice, it's really a lifelong journey. And so we're all in it together and really happy that you showed up today. As Dr. Alexander mentioned, my name is Ike Ramos, educator, now, in the ed tech world as a director and also as a parent of a second grader. So I deal with equity and social justice and racial justice in a lot of different forms, whether it's through my work or my career and also as a parent. And so just excited to be here. And I'll share more later on, but I think that's enough to get us started.
Thank you so much. And we're going to move to Joquetta.
Good morning, good evening, good night, all those other things. I bring you greetings from Baltimore, Maryland. I'm excited to be here. My name is Joquetta Johnson. I am a specialist in Baltimore County Public Schools. I am an equity and cultural proficiency specialist in our school district. That's a mouthful. Prior to that, I spent 26 years as a school librarian, and equity is just who I am. It's one of those things, as we'll talk over the next hour or two, that equity is more than a word. It's a way of being. And so that's what we want to move from, just something that we do, that is a word, to embodying all of the principles related to equity. And I'm super excited to be here with this, as Doc said, amazing, awesome panel.
Thank you so much. And then we have Melody.
Hey, everybody. My name is Melody McAllister, and I can't believe they keep inviting me back, but I'm so glad to be here. Everybody has these wonderful credentials. I am a master learner. I think that the best thing I have to offer is just that I have lived a couple of different lives, and I'm on the path of learning and sharing. I am an educator, an author, a mother. I do have the book, I'm Sorry story. It's not super well known, so I'm going to use this time to put it out there, but it engulfs everything that I believe. And it's also in Spanish. But yeah, and you can find me on all the socials at MJ McCallie Writes. But I'm so glad to be here and share. I have a big mouth, so I'm always sharing, and I'm looking forward to getting to know everybody. Thank you for being here. Thanks for inviting me, Dr. Desiree.
Of course. And Dr. Tiffany.
I will just say greetings, because depending on where you are in the world, it is a different time zone. And I want to say welcome. And I do applaud, as has the rest of the panel, you attending today on a Saturday, taking time out for a topic that is incredibly important. It is important to us. And Mel sells herself short. I think we're all master learners, because this is our 4th time together, as I posted on my own Twitter. And the reality is, every time we do this, I think we leave as a team, knowing more, learning more, wanting to know more, and be able to do more. I'm a veteran educator. This is year 26 for me. I am a Louisianian. So we just dealt with Ida, but hey, we are survivors always. I'm currently the content supervisor for social studies that deals with K-12, and I have gotten quite a few questions over the summer as well as this year about this issue of equity, cultural responsive and sustaining teaching, critical race theory. And as a biracial woman in the South with children and grandchildren that don't always look like everybody else, it becomes just that much more important to be an equity influencer. So thank you for having us here with you. And we assure you that we don't have every answer, but we'll give you some good thinking points or good places to go and get started for yourself, because this truly has to be your journey. It cannot be a journey someone defines for you. Thank you.
So y'all, that was just the introduction. I feel like we could go. I feel like we could just mic drop and leave right now. And that was just the introduction. So when I say amazing panel, you know that I don't lie. And I am Dr. Desiree Alexander. I am the founder, CEO of Educator Alexander Consulting. I also am the regional director of North Louisiana for an educational nonprofit. I was a 6th grade and 8th grade English teacher, high school English teacher, middle school librarian, high school librarian, and then district level instructional technology supervisor. So that's been my 19 years in education so far. And now I'm doing this. So I'm very happy to not only be on the panel, but to moderate the panel today. So I'm going to kind of control myself with participating and be more of a moderator today. So I want to start off with the panel. And this is kind of an open question to anyone. And I want to first start doing some vocabulary, right? We hear so many words. I do a session on the equity cycle. And that's one of the things we talk about is what is bias? What is racism? What is anti-racism? We have so many words that we throw around that sometimes it's hard to even know what we're talking about and know what the definition is. So I'm going to start with equity, since that is in our title. How do you define equity? And this is open for anyone. Oh, you're muted, Joquetta.
I guess I'll start with how I define equity. And I'm so glad that we're starting with vocabulary, like we said, because so often I know other organizations and job fields, they have a lot of vocabulary, but I swear in education, it's like the latest buzzword, and whatever the buzzword is the thing that we jump on to do and bring it into our spaces. So one of the things I think when we think about equity, people will say, oh, equity is making sure that every child gets what they need, right? To make sure they meet their optimum success. And that is one part of it, making sure everyone gets their need. But I think there are some other key pieces that I think that we missed that's really important about the equity that, and this comes from Equity Literacy Foundation, which I love, because they said, it's not just about giving every child or every person, if that matters, well, what they need, but it's also important that we have to look at our own personal and institutional biases as we look at equity, right? So equity is not just giving everyone what they need, but equity is also the process in which we look at things like policies, procedures, our institutional cultures, all our ideologies that are built around. And it's meaningful to look at it also through the lens of the interests of those marginalized groups who are often historically have been disproportionately underrepresented or at the margins. So for me, equity is not just about giving everyone what they need, but it's also looking at our policies, our procedures, and our ideologies that also are baked in as part of our systems and structures. So that's my look at the equity pieces. And that the other part of the equity is, like, if I summed it up in 3 key words, is support. It's the support that we give to others, it's how we treat others, it's access to resources, and the resources and support that we give to others. So that would be for me, in a nutshell, what equity is. Not just giving everyone what they need, but also looking at our policies and procedures as well.
Beautiful. Does anybody else want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, I'll just come back and say that I absolutely and totally agree with Jaquetta. All too often we think it is as simple as making sure everyone has what they need. But I can give every child everything he or she needs. But if I'm still not checking my biases, my beliefs, my practices, if I'm still not aware of how policy informs what I'm required to teach or how I'm required to engage with learners, then I stop short, I fall short. And so to add to that, I would just simply say equity is not only about creating those spaces, opportunities, and that accessibility, but understand my responsibility and making sure that that lives for every person I encounter, because it won't be just our learners. It'll be our colleagues and our peers. It'll be the families and the communities. It will be everyone that we encounter. And we have to understand that there is a responsibility that we bear with equity. So what is yours? Yours may be different than mine is. Mine may be different from Melody's or from Ike's, for that matter.
I want to take a question that was raised and asked. Can we truly speak about equity or truly push the equity agenda without looking at the systems in place? Can we actually have equity without looking at those systems? Can you take that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to kind of piggyback on that anyhow from what Miss Tiffany was sharing. And I think it's important to see it as a spectrum, right? It's not we definitely have an end goal in mind to where we're addressing all of the very unique needs of everybody that exists within the system. But I think, what's important is to take into account those actual unique needs of everybody, right? So if we're going to be talking about equity, it does require us to look at the individual needs, but then to zoom out and look at the system and how the system is impacting each individual. Because a big trap with equity is lumping everybody together, right? All young Black boys, all English learners, all female students, whatever the case might be, that's a common trap we see. And a lot of times when we're having equity conversations, they're around these big buckets, which of course is, at the root of equity is treating everybody as the individual that they are, right? And so it's a common trap to fall in. So, that's kind of what I'll say to that is I think it's always important to have the macro and the micro view on things, right? Zoning all the way into the individual needs of people that we're in contact with and working with, the stories that we're hearing, and then zooming out and looking at how the structures, the policies in place are impacting those individuals. And, that's kind of why it's heavy work, right? It's a complicated task to take on, but I think, that's kind of my approach to it.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Go right ahead, Melody. You're muted.
Yeah. So, and I love that you said it's heavy work. And there are so many people that have seen and heard everything that all of us have seen and heard, but they're more stuck on, but I want to believe what I want to believe. And I just hate that that's a part of our culture, but it is. So I just want to say, those of you that are here in attendance today and everybody on this panel, like, this is heavy work. We truly have to link arms and go through this journey together, because it's also very lonely. And so when we do link up and do this, it's pretty amazing. Like, this is an amazing moment, especially for me to be a part of. And I'll share a little bit more about this later, but it is heavy work, like Ike said, and it requires you to really dig deep and go into what you've always believed and assumed about people, and to reflect on that and clean it up. And a lot of times I've had to clean up my thinking. I've had to, why am I being defensive right now? Why am I, agreeing with this person as opposed to this person? And it's heavy work. And I agree. So I'm so grateful for everybody being here today.
Thank y'all so much. And we have a lot of good conversations happening in the chat as well. So definitely look at the chat, don't sleep on the chat during this session. And I will say that if a link is put in the chat, it's also being put on our resource list. So you don't have to be like, oh, I got to get this link. It's going to be on the resource list. We promise. But thank you for that conversation. And I do want to go through, before we kind of move on to the next kind of thought process, I want to ask about race and ethnicity, because those are two that get really, really kind of bungled up a bunch. So how would you define race and ethnicity kind of together?
Well, I'll go. So for me, and this is my truth, I tend to shy away from the word perspective, because I think it can get us kind of muddied, because perspectives are always things that can be then become points of contention and argument, whereas we just need a more accurate storytelling, what is factual and provable. And so for me, race is really the social construct that has been defined and determined by another entity for us. If we look at our nation, for example, white people don't become white in this country until the introduction of slavery. Before then, you were identified by your ethnic or your cultural roots. So if you were German, from Germany, you were German. If you were from Poland, you were Polish. You were defined by that ethnic group. When we bring slaves into the country, now we're looking at these groups of people, and there's one very stark contrast. Don't get me wrong, there's shades in my mother's family as much as there are in my father's, but there's a stark contrast in what we see in these two groups. And so what we develop is the constructs of race. What's white, what's black, whereas ethnicity, that's that cultural makeup. So my mother's paternal grandmother is German, her maternal grandfather is from Madrid, so he is Spanish. So when I think of race, I think of the social constructs that have been defined for me. And as a biracial woman, you have to ask the question, so which box do you check, Tiffany? I forever got in school because I always marked both of them. I didn't know any better. So when you do your count at the beginning of the year, they had one extra kid, because when they're counting girls, then they had one extra girl all the time until they finally figured it out. But then culturally or ethnically, there's so many other things that make me up. I say, as eclectic as Louisiana is with our gumbo making, that's what we see in terms of culture and ethnicity sometimes. So for me, that's how I reference or frame the two differences between race and ethnicity.
Beautiful, beautiful. Would anyone else like to address that, or? All right. So because I think that was really great. Go ahead, Ike.
I was just going to piggyback. I think it was beautifully said. I just wanted to share kind of like personal story of how us as adults still deal with it and trying to juggle race and ethnicity. And then more so with the implication of, imagine if I'm thinking about it, what are our students? How are they processing this information, right? And so one thing that I always struggled with is when filling out the demographic data, you know, if you're Latino, you have to choose white as your race. And then beneath that, under ethnicity, that's where you can pick Hispanic. You know, in my head, how I would process the data is, well, racially Hispanic or Latino, but ethnicity, I'm Mexican, right? But that has never been an option, you know, in there. So I had to wrestle with that and you know, dive into some of the definitions that, like, you know, Ms. Tiffany just shared with us. But it, you know, I saw that as a principal as well with a lot of my parents. You know, the school I was at was 99%, or one of the schools I was principal at was 99% Latino, majority Mexican, and 67% English learners. And that form blew their mind every time. Like, I don't have an option on here for me. You know, so that's why it's so important to understand those terms. What is race? What is ethnicity? What is culture? Because really, I think everybody's here to want to be, you know, an ally, an advocate, and an activist, which we're going to dive into later. But we all want to be helpful, you know, if we're here. We want to learn, grow so that we can be helpful and impact society in a positive way. And so that's why those terms are so important for us to get a handle on, because that's something I didn't get a handle on till later, right? When I was kind of forced to study some of this stuff as a principal and culturally responsive teaching courses, et cetera. So I just wanted to share that. And if anybody else has had that, you know, you're definitely not alone. And it's something that impacts us as adults, and even more so our students.
And thank you for bringing that up, because that's a great segue, because when we talked about what is equity, two words I think we also need to include when we talk about race and ethnicity is diversity and inclusion, right? So when we think about that, because those are the other ones, we always see DEI work and all those vocabulary, right? So that diversity is all those identity markers. So that is race and ethnicity and gender identity, class, and it's a whole host of them, right? And then inclusion. And so when we think about diversity, I think of that as, like, if we talk about data, that's like the quantitative, like how many African Americans, how many Blacks, how many Hispanics, how many girls, how many LGBTQ, non-binary, et cetera, et cetera. But then we think about inclusion. Inclusion is, how do people feel in that space? So the inclusion is, how are people feeling? Everybody wants to be seen, heard, and affirmed. And so when you mention that, Ike, about, you know, you're not sure where you see yourself on that box. So that's the policy piece, like something as simple as forms. Do people see themselves when they have to go check themselves on a form? That makes it, I got to decide, I got to pick something that's not here. That's that inclusion piece, right? Everything from, like, being in a classroom, because you can have diversity and not have inclusion. And that's important as well, because one of the things I've seen as a Black female is I sometimes in schools say, well, we don't have diversity issues here because our school's predominantly Black. But it means you're grabbing everybody together. Just because I'm Black, if we go to ethnicity, I may have someone from Africa, I may have Nigerian, I may have someone from Haitian. That's just because on the outside, I'll have to check the box that I'm Black. When we look at all those other things, that makes who I am. So that's why it's so important to look at understanding the vocabulary. So you can have diversity and no inclusion. You can have, and I think we also need to be very intentional too about vocabulary, because often when we say things like, I'm in a diverse population, we're using that as code for race. So we need to be very intentional when I say I'm in diverse, because diverse, I could be in a school with all white people and it could be very diverse. And that's not diverse by race, but it could be by age, it could be by religion, it could be by educational status. So again, because we so feel like we're in a place where it's not, we don't feel comfortable saying words, race, right? So we'll just use it as code, but we can't fix what we don't name. So we have to be very, very intentional, because even talking about equity, are we talking about racial equity? Or we could be talking about equity for LGBTQ. We could be talking about for girls. We could talk about for special education. We could talk about our immigrant population, right? But so that's, again, just being very intentional. And so you cannot do diversity and inclusion without equity. And I think
let me piggyback on that and move us along a little bit and ask about So with that same mindset, how do we address people's identities? You know, we have a lot of questions around, even just in the African American community. Do I call them African Americans? Do I call them Black? Do I call them, you know, what are the right terms for the right people? And I think it's one of those things where I kind of brought up a little bit is no group is homogenous, right? We have to get off of this whole group thinks the same way, and we can just, so just a very quick conversation on how do we address people's identities?
I think the best thing to do is ask the person, how would you like to be identified? It's the same way if someone asks me my name. If you say Jaquetta, do you prefer me called you Jaquetta, or is it okay if how would you like me, you know, to be called?
100% Jaquetta, 100%.
Is it okay? Is it okay if I share a story about this, of actually asking my students what they preferred? So in a reading group, and I was teaching 5th grade at the time, and this was a reading group of, I think, only boys. And it was diverse. There was a young man from somewhere in the Middle East. I can't remember which country he was actually from, but he was new. He was new to our country. He was new to our classroom and our school. And I had a young man who was from Mexico, and I had a young Black man. We were all sitting there, and we were reading this story together. And we started talking about names and what did we like to be called. And I listened to each one. I said, well, what do you guys like to be called? Do you, and I had a very close relationship with these young students. So this wasn't an odd conversation to have. And one of the young boys said, I don't mind being called Black or African American. It doesn't bother me either way. The young boy from Mexico said, I am Mexican, but when my neighbors talk about it, they say Mexican in a way that is hurtful. And then I got to another the other young man, and I was like, well, what do you like to be called? And he said, I just like to be called Abraham, because that was his name. And when he said that was just like, okay. And then we moved on, but it was just something, but when you ask students, they will tell you, and they will tell you everything that they want to tell you if you create a space where they are able to speak the truth. And so that has always stayed with me. And that was like at least 10 years ago.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. And I want to connect this with, in order for you to even ask that question, or in order for you to be able to respond to that question, you have to know yourself. So I'm going to leave this to Jaquetta with an activity that we're going to do about unpacking who you are. Jaquetta? You're muted.
I'm so sorry. I've just been constantly muting myself here today. I'm about asking who we are. So let me give me 1 second here. And I'm going to start with I'm just going to share the video clip, what is your why? And I think that's so important, identifying your why, because the why asks me, who am I? And what is my purpose? So we'll start with that video, and then we will move on. Give me 1 second. I'm going to mute myself while I share my screen.
How do I know? They always want to put the what behind it. How do I know what I'm supposed to do? The question that you really should ask is, how do I know why I'm here? Because when you know your why, your what becomes more clear and more impactful. If you know, like for instance, people know that I do comedy, but that's what I do. My why is to inspire people to walk in purpose. So I can do comedy, I can write books, I can be in a movie, because all of it is motivated by my why. In fact, I have a new web series out called Michael Jr. Break Time. We probably just did the 6th episode. It's on YouTube. So every single Wednesday at 3:00, we drop a new episode on YouTube of Michael Jr. Break Time. What it is it's me. I travel around the country and I do stand-up comedy, in case you didn't know. And in the middle of my comedy set sometime, I'll stop and just talk to my audience. And we've been filming this, and it's you know, it's pretty cool. So we're in Winston-Salem. I'm gonna show you a clip from Winston-Salem. And I'm just talking to this guy in the audience, and he tells me that he's a musical instructor at a school. So I was like, all right, you're a musical instructor, you know, can you sing? Let me hear you sing a song. So this is what happened at the last episode of Michael Jr.'s Break Time. Check it. So you're a musical director.
Yes, sir.
All right, so let me get a couple bars of like Amazing Grace. Can you do the first part of that? Go ahead. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Wow. That bro could sing, you know what I'm saying? Now, what you give me the version is if your uncle just got out of jail, you got shot in the back when you was a kid. I'm just saying, let me see the hood version real quick. If you know which version I'm talking about, just see if that exists. Let me see what you got. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I see. Okay. Here's what I want you to catch. The first time I asked him to sing, he knew what he was doing. The second time, he knew why he was doing it. When you know your why, your what becomes more impactful because you're walking towards or in your purpose. All right, so I'm going to just stop it right there, and I'm going to stop unsharing my screen. All righty. And so what I just want us to think about for one moment, if you could place in the chat box, one of the key questions that he stated is like, what is the why? So the why is the one constant will guide you towards your fulfillment in your work and your life and your purpose. So just take a moment to reflect. You put any comments you have in the chat box, but what is your why? Just put in the chat box for us. And while people are putting things in the chat box, if anyone on the panel wants to share, we could do that as well. And I just want to keep it moving along. But I think that's so important as we talk about who am I in this work? Because when we think about working with others, I got to figure out who I am first. And I think it was Dr. Tiffany said at the beginning, this is a personal journey, right? And knowing who I am, unpacking who I am as a female and all of the multiple identities that we have, which falls under that diversity piece, right? When I look at my age, I saw someone put in the chat box about disabilities, it's sexual orientation, it's mental, physical, is gender identity. There's so many layers to us. So who are you in this moment? No, give us a second. Trying to get my screen back.
That was so powerful. Joquetta, I just like, I had goosebumps all over. And I think your why really is what drives you, because if it's very superficial, you are going to fall flat on your face and quit. But if your why really like is for other people and your own learning, that's what carries you through when things get hard, you know, so.
One of the things I noted, my why is to ensure that I'm always able to create those places and those spaces that are both safe and nurturing, as to give individuals the opportunity just to be their authentic self. And it's not for me to judge. And look, I don't have to believe what you believe to allow you to walk in your truth. Your light shining doesn't minimize my light. And again, growing up biracial in the South, that was something that I had to learn to fit where I belong, because because this has always been an honest dialogue. I am extremely light, but never going to be light enough to be white. And then because I am so light, my Blackness is often in question. Am I a sellout? Where do I belong? So my responsibility is to create the spaces and the places to allow learners to be their authentic self and to be able to walk in their truth, understanding that it's okay to be who you are, as long as you understand why and where you're going with it.
And I love that Joyce in the chat and it's brought up "We Wear the Mask," and it's actually my favorite poem, because it's never not relevant, and I do feel like we do wear masks to survive, right? Not even because we want to fit in and we want to succeed, and to survive. So knowing who you are, sometimes it gets really confusing, especially for marginalized groups, right? Especially for marginalized groups, you learn to wear the mask to survive, but then sometimes that leaves you with a not good sense of self, because you don't know who self is, because you've been wearing the mask so long. You never had an opportunity to identify who self was. You're constantly checking boxes, right? You're constantly fitting in to something that someone else has created. So I think that when you do stop and really start looking at your own identity, it can be very disorienting. It can be very confusing. It can leave you with self-guilt and shame. I know when, a lot of the things happened last summer, which was not new for many of us, but was new for some. And, I was getting Twitter DMs and things like that saying, I feel so ashamed that I've never spoken up. I feel so ashamed that I've never, and this was from all races of people, that I have never spoken life to what I knew was going on, and I feel the shame from it. And one of the things I would tell them is we have to start where we are. We have to let go of that, and we have to start learning better, doing better. We have to start from now. But I love that. The knowing your why. And when Joyce brought up "We Wear the Mask," because it is my favorite poem, it really brought up yes.
I think that's so significant because understanding who we are also helps me put a lens to trying to recognize who my students are, right? Because so I have to understand my background, my culture, how I grew up, my belief, the lens that I have, my cultural frame of reference, right? Currently, I'm a doctoral student, and my dissertation is focusing on cultural responsiveness, and it's looking at that equity focused PD. And we, for example, many of us are here today because we want to learn about equity. We want to learn about being culturally responsive, but we haven't even unpacked our own culture and who we are. And then we're being asked to do culturally responsive and culturally relevant and all those buzzwords and justice. And we haven't even unpacked our things. And it's not a judgment. And I'm glad you brought that up, because you can feel a lot of shame, regardless of race or ethnicity, because of the culture that we lived in. We have been indoctrinated to believe certain things, socially constructed, that we often push upon our students and we push upon ourselves. So this is definitely a place to feel like this is a no judgment place. One of the wonderful books I read is we use in our work is called The Art of Holding Space, because often we talk about creating safe spaces. And again, I try to be very intentional with my vocabulary, because I can't guarantee a safe space. And when I'm saying safe space, often, and we know this from the best place, like we want to create a place that's safe for our kids and our staff to have conversations, but I cannot promise that someone may say something that may not be intentionally cause some harm. So I think of it as she talks about, Heather Platt talks about holding space. And holding space is that it means that we are willing to walk along another's person, whatever journey they're on, without judgment, making them feel inadequate, trying to fix them, or trying to impact the income. When we hold space for other people, we open our hearts, offer unconditional support, and let go of judgment and control. And I think that's our work. And also letting low of our own judgment that we may be having ourselves, our own guilt that we are holding ourselves. So I love when you mentioned that, Desiree, like the guilt that we even have. I didn't speak up. I didn't say something. Because again, depending upon the bias that we show, we know that if we speak up, it could be more problematic than others. But we have to find that space. So that's all that I have on that, so we can move forward. But thank you. And thanks for everyone for sharing.
Thank you so much. And Joquetta, can you please put the name of the book and a link to it on our resource sheet?
I sure will.
And also a link to the video, because those are the things that people ask for in the chat.
It will be there.
Picking up on that and moving to the CRTs, right? Kind of hot button issues right now. And if you don't know what the two CRTs are, it is critical race theory that we hear a bunch about, and culturally responsive teaching. So we want to talk about both of those. I will say I'm in Shreveport, Louisiana now, and the news was going to have a discussion on critical race theory. And I wasn't going to be home that day. So I was like, I'm going to record this because I would love to see what both sides are saying, that kind of thing, because I like to hear and I like to learn, So I watched it, and I actually posted it on my personal Facebook page because I was just so disappointed. And it was no discussion at all. It was no definition. It was like, this was the literal definition. People say that race critical, and they just went on. I was like, well, what's the real definition? Like, did anybody read anything or look like it was just a straight kind of opinion hit piece on critical race theory. And it was just so disappointing because I honestly wanted to hear both sides. And it was just like, okay, well, great. So let's have a conversation on the first CRT, which is critical race theory. And why is it such a hot button issue in today's world?
Well, I think I'll go first if you all don't mind. To the point of critical race theory, it is not new. We're talking about a theoretical framework that is more than 4 decades old, first of all. And whenever I get calls about whether or not we should be teaching critical race theory, I always ask, tell me what it is. Because if you can tell me what it is, then I'll know if you're positioned to teach. It is not a curriculum, that's for sure. It's not even a curricular resource. But I think the reason it is such a hot button topic is because there has been some fuel, especially here in Louisiana. I can't speak anywhere else. I'll leave that to Joquetta, Ike, Mel to do. That we are trying to indoctrinate white students into feeling bad or feeling guilty, or we're trying to slight the historical narrative in such a way as to the undoing of the way we taught history or what has been recorded in literature. So it has been demonized that it is to put the world, the education community, policy at large, now to put it against white people. And so that's why when we're at Bessie and we had them petitioning, and literally because we're rewriting or revising rather our social studies standards right now. And obviously this became a topic because the steering committee strongly felt that culturally responsive and sustaining education, I always put the S with that other CRT because we do need to sustain it, that we are somehow, we could teach the positive sides of slavery, but we did not want to teach or give students the opportunity at looking at the facts and letting them research. And to that, I always give this example I've taught, I think every social studies there probably is, but 6th grade is probably one of my favorites. But I did a lesson on Columbus. And one of the things, knowing my bias, again, you have to know who you are. I just put Columbus, hero, villain, and I let the students go and find the facts. I gave them some leading things, and I let them go and research and come up with their own conclusion. And so again, I think CRT has been met with such adversity because they now believe we're going to be leading children down a path that is going to make them anti-American or anti-white, or to even make whites feel bad or guilty about the truth of history. And that's not at all what it stems from. And so I got a call from the State Department. It was actually at 8 o'clock one evening because they had a meeting the next day. It's like, what do I do about this? And my response was a simple response. And this is where I get let's pull back away from perspectives, because it can be very misleading. Don't give your perspective. Can we give a more accurate version of the truth? What are the facts? What can be proven? What can we prove, and allow that to come forward? So to the culturally responsive teaching component, we've talked about race and ethnicity. We've opened up and did a little bit of unpacking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all too often the pieces that we do miss out on, that we don't take into consideration. Children that are struggling with word problems in math, that may not speak English fluently, or even those that do. From what perspective or what lens have we crafted curriculum? What is the policy behind curriculum that has been developed and put forward to teachers? And in that vein, how do we need to shape it such that we are including, we are hearing students' voices, we are giving them, places to speak? And I'll bow to my colleagues here, because there's so much more that you can do with this.
And I do want to say two things to that. Is one, look it up. There was that comment about the positive aspects of slavery was actually said in a Louisiana, was it a legislature meeting or a Bessie board meeting? So look that up.
It was the Senate Education Committee leader, and he put that forward.
Yeah, he actually said those words, the positive parts of slavery.
Let's teach children the positive side of slavery.
Yeah, so that was actually said. I think I posted it on my Twitter. But I also want to talk about one of the words that Dr. Tiffany used was truth. And I think that one of the ways we got off the rails, at least in America, is when we don't even recognize truth anymore, because we can have alternative facts. So if you really think about, that really got us, you can't even say truth anymore, because now we say your truth. No, there's truth. We were getting away from reality by saying, oh, well, no, it's your truth, or it's an alternative truth. So just, I'm gonna stop right there. But when she said truth, I was like, which one? Which truth are we talking about right now? But I heed to the rest of the panel.
I mean, it is so powerful to teach kids how to find truth, because our textbooks are filled with so many untruths. And that is what people have a hard time accepting, because we have been indoctrinated in this country, at least. I mean, this is from, growing up where I have, and we don't want to face that truth, because it is hard work to uncover what is real.
And I think when we're talking about, CRT and others theories, I think it goes back to, again, we have to unpack, and this goes back to the equity piece, right? And looking at policies, procedures, understanding historical and social and political aspects of education, right? This is, all of this is tied together, right? So when we're having someone speak in a space talking about the happy side of people being enslaved, because that's a different thing too. They are enslaved. This wasn't a choice. I was enslaved. Where does that come from? And it goes back to that socially constructed knowledge and people's beliefs. How did you come to believe this, right? And people are sitting in positions that are very detrimental to our students, to our professions and things that we do as well. Even we look at, Dr. Tiffany said, curriculum. So really, when I think about CRT, whether it's critical race theory, basically it's a lens of how we see the world. And they're basically saying, this is what racism is. It's a step in part of our, society. And there's things that we look for. It's a lens. But you have to ask yourself why. Why are people challenging that? We're not challenging balloons, which is a theory. How many theories do we have in education that we're using? Right? But no one's challenging those. We're challenging the critical what? Critical race. Right? When we talk about culture responsive teaching, again, culture is more than just race, but we use culture as code often for race, because culturally responsive doesn't necessarily mean that I have to be talking about a specific race, even though that's when it was formulated. We got culturally responsive, we got culturally relevant, we got culturally sustaining, we got all of that. That's a whole nother conversation. It was built around Geneva Gate. And I always tell people, go, again, one of those things in education that I feel like when we get in schools, we get the information, we just take it on. We need to do our own research. Do we even know who the people who did the founding parts of critical race theory, right? Do we even really know, Goya, Lance, and Billings, who did constantly responsive, right? Go to the source. That's the library. Go to the source, because we have disinformation, we have misinformation, and then we just got fake news. All of those things are happening at the same time. So it's very easy, even for myself, to like, you hear all these words just thrown around and we just throw them around, and each one of them has their own meaning. So just realize it's just a lens that we're looking at through the world, but question, why is it that it's the critical race? And listen to the conversations. This is the equity lens, but we're not challenging up. We got multiple intelligence, we got UDL, we have a whole lot of different theories and things that we use in education. Nobody's talking about those. So that's the part about the lens and listening and unpacking. And again, just dig down and do some research yourself. That's the best way that I can say it. And we'll put some articles in there for you related about what it is and why is it under attack and who is attacking it and why. That's the other thing. Ask yourself questions.
And I'm going to say everything that Joquetta is saying, like I'm reading right here in this. I love this book, and I try to put it, Courageous Conversations About Race by Glenn Singleton. And I was like literally reading stuff that she was saying, it's all there. This has really helped me to be better, to talk about it, and say the right words. I still struggle with that. And that's why I think I learned so much from everybody on this panel and even the people talking. So, but I love this book and everything Joquetta is saying, like, it's just being validated. So, and I'll drop that too.
I saw you unmute. Did you want to contribute?
I just love what everybody has said, and I love where Melody picked up, piggybacking on Tiffany on seeking truth, and I think that's what our kids need more than anything, right? Is when it is, they need both, right? They need the truth shared with them. They also need to be taught the skills to seek the truth out and be critical consumers of content, right? And Joquetta picked up right on that too. So I just love the way that you three wove it all together, because I think that's the essence of education, right? Is we want to create critical thinkers who can navigate this complex world where you're right, people aren't sharing the truth. They share their perspective or their interpretation of the truth, and everybody is seeing things through lenses. But even that in of itself is a skill, and we're gonna dive into it here in a little bit. But it definitely starts with the self, right? Like, if I don't know my own identity, my own biases, my own privileges, my own oppressions, how can I even begin to really dig deep with my students, or if I'm a leader, the staff I serve, the parents, the community I work with, etc. So I just love how you guys really honed in on that and kind of wanted to emphasize that.
I absolutely love this conversation. And I will say, even though, and I think it was Joquetta who said this, and excuse me if it wasn't, but stop bandwagging. Like, I know that it's easier to just be like, let me listen and let them tell me how I feel about this topic. Go research it yourself. That's the only way you're actually going to know how you feel about it. Because I know so many people that will say, okay, well, person A is always against person B. So if person A says it, I'm going to automatically be against it, and I'm going to be on person B's side. It's like, that's you're just jumping on a bandwagon without even knowing not even how you feel about it, but not even knowing what it is. So please, and I know it's easy to do because I've literally had people say, oh, I'm going to go watch blank news station so they can tell me how I feel about this topic. What? Like, and I've heard it on both sides of the, but it's mind blowing because I'm like, wouldn't you want to know yourself? Wouldn't you want to come up? And that's just too hard. I'd rather them tell me how I feel about it. And then I'm going to go and protest in the street about whatever they tell. Like we have to stop it. We are losing ourselves because we have no opinions, because we don't want to have an opinion, because it's too hard to have an opinion. And as educators, stop. Like, you have to go research this yourself because you are teaching the next generation, and we need you to be informed, and we need you to create critical thinkers versus you just telling them not only how you feel about it, but what you regurgitated from the news, and you don't even know about whatever it is. So please, please, please start critically thinking and start teaching our students how to critically think. I'm going to throw it to Dr. Tiffany for an activity when we're talking about the 2 CRTs. But before we do that, I want to make sure that no one else has anything else to say about the other CRT. I know we talked more about critical race theory than culturally responsive teaching, but we kind of put them together. Does anyone else have anything else to say about culturally responsive teaching before we throw it to Dr. Tiffany?
Or just say to Gioquetta's point, do your own homework, study to show thyself approved, because not only has critical race theory become the one theory that is under attack, but it has spread to what is culturally responsive or social emotional learning or trauma informed education. So now all of these things are being lumped into one category because it is just safer to be ignorant and hate everything than it is to develop and understand anything. Sometimes Google is your friend, Mel. It is a verb and it can help, but we also have to know what we're Googling and how we're Googling and what we're looking for, because you've got to vet what's out there. I could put a lot of things out there. Does that mean, goes back, Jaquetta posted in the chat and I was just like, yes, there is a distinct difference between facts and truth. I can give you the facts. You're going to craft your truth. You and I can have the same facts and have 2 different truths based on the same set of facts. Is that not what we have in this country right now? When people use the statement, well, slaves came from Africa, I go, no, Africans came from Africa and were enslaved. Now, you hear those 2 statements and people never think about something that simple. They literally say slaves came from Africa. Well, I've got an historical record that shows me they came from other places long before they were taken out of Africa. But we say that like that is, well, they must have already been slaves, so we didn't do anything to them. No, Africans were taken from Africa and enslaved. So study to show thyself approved. Then you don't have to be made an open shame.
All right, so with that mic drop, we're going to bring it back to Dr. Tiffany. I think everybody just like sitting there smiling like, okay, well, there's nothing else to say from that. We're going to go ahead and bring it back to Dr. Tiffany for our activity.
My task was, because these 2 topics are so, they're on fire right now. And teachers have materials, they have activities, things to do. And it's so, how do I do this? And when you mentioned we wear the mask, I was like, God dog it. So it's already in the thing. No, it's okay. But I want us, and I did put the link, I just submitted it there. If you had to teach this, so what we want you to think about is if you had to teach this to a very diverse and inclusive, right, Jaquetta, diverse and inclusive classroom, what does the poem, The Rose That Grew from Concrete, how would you teach this? So you can open the link that is there for a moment, and I want you to think about it, but I'm gonna read it to you. We do know that this is from our author, actor, just a brilliant lyricist and thinker, the one and only Tupac Shakur. And it reads, did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete? Proving nature's law is wrong. It learned to walk without having feet. Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete when no one else ever cared. How would you take this in that classroom and allow your learners, how now, mind you, we have to teach, you know, what stanzas are. We've got to teach iambic pentameter. We've got to get them ready for idea and all of these other pieces. But if you have to teach this, what does this look like? How would you approach it? So in the chat, if you will, what would be some of the strategies you use? And again, this, if I had to give you the makeup of a classroom, I actually did that. I want to be mindful. So your class, you've got 23 learners. 17 are Black, 3 are Asian, 2 are white, 1 is transgender. How do you teach that? Because that's a topic we stay away from. We don't want to get involved in the whole sexuality issue. Like it's not a part of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like that becomes, I see you. But so how would you approach this? What would be some of the things that you would do with your students? Now, I just want to wait to hear from the panel. You guys in the audience have already put up such a great, I'm so glad we get to keep the chat, Doc, because it is so powerful. It's literally on fire. But that's a brief poem. It wouldn't take a lot of time, but you'd be surprised at how complicated the dialogue is in there. What would you do with your learners?
Well, I will say that, I mean, I love this, and the way that you read it, Dr. Tiffany, would like gave me goosebumps. I feel like this is like a foundational poem that you could begin the year on. And your sincerity and the way that you present it can never be hidden from students. So when we're working on all of these aspects and trying to create, like Joquetta was saying, not a safe space particularly, but you know, sharing space. I think this is so foundational, and then living it like this is an everyday thing. Creating that environment where students can come to you privately and share what they are, and then actually some of this is new to a lot of us. How do you teach to a transgender student who is still facing a lot of public animosity towards their very own lives? How do you help them, equip them that they can speak and be themselves in a society that says, a huge part of society that still says you're wrong? And I think creating that space where they can share and everything that you do. Sometimes we get so lost in curriculum, we forget that students have the voice and the choice. I mean, those are two ways to focus on that, and allowing them to express how it is relevant to their lives and giving them opportunities to share how it is relevant. I'm sorry, I'll shut up. You go.
No, I just wanted to read what Kate put in the chat. She said she thinks she would have them draw it, and if not then, maybe later, if they felt comfortable, ask them to label the roads, the concrete, the people walking by, those who did not care, the fresh air as it applies to their own lives or the lives of those they know. I literally had chills right now. Joy says she would ask students to think about the sidewalk they passed on the way to school. Post that, then read the poem, have them draw it again after the poem, then start talking about the messages in the poem, then talk about the technique. This literally is fire, Ike. This literally is fire. You guys are taking this, and I'll put some other topics in, but I want you to understand that it's not, I use that poem because it really just is so, for me, so personally impactful. And again, if you as an educator, if you don't feel it, if you don't care about it, our kids, to Melody's point, they know when we're sincere. I'll give the example of a teacher that's taught calculus for 20 years. She just works the problem. I'm the student, I ask the question. And she's stumped because she's been so procedural for the last 20 years. I just threw out a need for conceptual understanding and she can't give it to me because she has it rehearsed. She no longer knows the why behind this getting to the solution. And our kids know that when they ask us those questions, if we don't feel it, if we don't feel compelled, if we're not passionate, if we're not open to being wrong and them telling us, you know what, Dr. McCoy, I don't agree with what you just said. And me being vulnerable enough to say, all right, talk to me, help me understand. Then we are really never going to create those spaces. And Joquetta, I ordered that book. Thank you. We're not going to be able to create those spaces that we're talking about, because to the title of that book, it is about being loyal and liberating without being judgmental or letting go of. And actually, I said this earlier. I don't have to let go of what I believe to validate, to love, to be dedicated or committed to or respectful to you. I don't have to change who I am as a believer, as a woman, as a person of color. I don't. It starts with, and I think Ike has put this in, Jaquetta has put this in, some of our panelists, it's respect, guys. And at the core of who any person is, they want to be respected for being a person, not for being a Black person, not for being a Black woman, not for being an educated woman, not for being a Hispanic or Latinx. You want to be respected for being human, for being a human being.
And I'll jump on that just as an educator. I know that it has gotten better, and it has kind of stopped, and it may have just stopped because I've talked about this before. But you know, when somebody will post on, let's say, Twitter, and they'll say, I'm looking for Black educators to follow. And then I'm put on a list of Black educators. And then I get like followers. And I just have, like, I'm just looking like you're literally following me because I have a little Black face. Like, you don't know anything about me. You don't know my value. You don't know my worth. And I'm supposed to be honored that you followed me because I have a Black face. And I was just like, do we not see a problem with this? With this system? Like, I'm like, that's okay. I didn't need you, but thank you. Like, I mean, I'm glad. Hopefully you learned something. But it's just one of those things where, you know, it's the intention versus the impact. You know, it's like, well, that's, you know, your intention may have been good to say, well, I want to follow more people of color, but like, what is your why? You know, still going back to that, like, is your why is you want to follow more people of color so you can say that you follow more people of color? Because I feel if you wanted to say, I want to learn more about equity, inclusion, diversity, anti-bias, anti-racism, then you're not going to say, I want to follow some Black folk. You're going to say, I want to follow people who are doing this work so I can learn from, you know what I'm saying? So it's just one of those things where we need to start thinking about what we're doing. And that's leading us into our next two topics. So our next topic is dealing with resistance, because we're talking about CRT and we're talking about all of this stuff. And even the poem that Dr. Tiffany just gave us. And I love that activity because it wasn't explicitly talking about race, because we know that in certain states that has been outlawed. Now that you can actually get fired from your job for doing that. But the activity that Dr. Tiffany just gave us, you're not explicitly doing that, right? So it was a very good kind of lesson to how you can bring up topics without bringing up topics. But how do we deal with resistance, panel? If I'm the only one on my campus trying to learn, trying to do better, trying to be better, and I am met with all of this resistance on my campus or from parents or from administration, from co-teachers, how do I deal with this? So anybody can pick this up, because it's very real in the lives of our educators right now, is that when they are trying to do better and be better, they're met with so much resistance. How do I deal with that?
I think first and foremost, you have got to recognize and accept knowing your why and being willing to shed a few pounds in the way of colleagues, friends, because you have to know You have to know it is going to cost you something. And to Asma's point, she put in, we're not willing to lose anything for the greater good. We're not losing. And I say this all the time. If education is a civil right, then teaching is a political act. And with politics, you take some hits. You're going to slay some giants, but you're going to take some losses as well. And you've got to be prepared and equipped to do that. You've got to have a skin thick enough to say that this is where I am. I understand that you don't want to be here now, and still be respectful, because again, we disagree with ideas, but without necessarily the people who present those ideas. Otherwise, it can become such an inflamed conflict. Now we do have things at the legislature for that very reason, Dr. Alexander, to your point. And you can lose your license because how dare I teach about race in American history? Yeah, okay, let's not do that. So there's going to be resistance. You've got to be prepared for it, and you've got to be prepared to be able. Can you stand alone? I always tell people this: my birth certificate says single birth. I didn't come here with anybody, so I'm good at standing on my own. So it's just me.
Well, I think also it depends upon where you are, and you also have to be very aware of the political and your safety at the same time. Because let's keep it real. The world is not a kind place right now. I mean, we have people who are going to war over wearing a mask and not wearing a mask. Let's just keep it 100%. So at that same time, when you feel like you are meeting resistance, do a serious check of safety first. And I'm just keeping it real. And also depending upon the body and the skin that you show up in, you may be even more harm. Depending upon what you are, who was resisting you and why. The old adage, you remember back in the days, I just go in my classroom, close my door, and do what's best for kids, right? And I still wholeheartedly believe that, because the other thing is, this is not, as I tell someone, administrator asked me, so how can I get everybody to buy in? I said, look, can you tell me any place where you got 100% buy-in on anything? We can't get everybody to agree, and we're gonna all use PowerPoint or Microsoft Teams or Zoom. So you think we're gonna get everybody to buy into equity? And that's the other thing is, when we talk about buying into this, we look at it as a technical solution, just the same we look at culturally responsive teaching as a technical solution. Because again, if you think of it as something that you do, it's a way of being, which means that is a personal journey that you have to constantly be working at and evolving. I can't make you do equity. I can't make you believe that this is the right thing to do. You're going to have to come to that in your own time and space. However, you can do things to try to hold people accountable, right? However they may look like in your space. And we know we have people here from all around the world, so that looks different in different schools, different systems, different everything. But just be in mind, when you're meeting that resistance, when you have those opportunities, just question everything and ask people why, and try to listen. So sometimes we often speak to respond instead of speaking to understand. So sometimes I just need to listen to what people are saying. So again, educating yourself helps also with resistance, right? Because sometimes, I don't know about you, sometimes I don't have the right words. I need to go get a little bit more information on this. But I can at least ask questions and say, tell me more about that. Why do you think this is a problem? Why can't we do this? So you are getting more information about why that person is and why they believe something, right? And so I think that's very, very important. But again, do what's best for those kids in your space, but also be mindful of your safety as well. I mean, who do we have to have that kind of conversation? But at the end of the day, I'm realizing, Mama, it's real. And I don't know if you saw in the news where the administrator asked somebody to wear a mask and the parent came back with a gun and stuff, like safety is also that too. So do what's best for kids, ask questions, educate yourself, and ask the questions so you can learn where other people are, and then begin. And when possible, form allies. This may be, if there's not someone in that building, seek organizations that may be in your community that can help support you in that work. Right? Because you may be the only one in your building, but there may be organizations. Reach out to your local colleges, reach out to nonprofit organizations who are also doing that work, who have more, so can maybe bring you some support as well. So that's just my thought about when you're meeting resistance.
And I'll piggyback on that and say, look for affinity groups. There are groups out there of educators on social media who are fighting the same fight that you're trying to that you're trying to fight. So start joining those groups, start speaking to educators who are trying to do better, because it's one of those things where the other side are joining groups. Like they're getting together and talking. So we have to do the same thing. We have to join groups and join forces, quote unquote, to do better and really to help. And I had a person, a friend, a coworker who just like Dakota was saying, think about your safety, who was called out on social media and had parents posting her address and that kind of thing. So it is happening. It's happening. It's a very strange, strange fruit. It's a very strange area that we're living in today. And so I do agree with her that when you get to the real of it, you do have to think about your safety, and you do have to think about where you are, because sometimes you also have to shed the school and maybe shed the district. And even though that's not an easy thing to say, is true. Sometimes you just have to get out of the situation because it's not a situation you need to be in. So I guess unfortunate, because the students are probably using you as a lifeline because you are, the one that's trying to do better, but sometimes you do have to move on.
Yeah. And I want to say that that is like very, very like extreme, but I don't know that it's always like, I definitely want to say that it's not like that is, it's important to remember to definitely think about your safety, but that's not always going to be the case as well. So don't let that hinder you from leading, if you are like one of the only white people that and you want to make things better. Because do you want me to share my screen, Dr. Desiree? Or
absolutely, we can go into the activity.
Sure. Okay, and I haven't done this for a while on Zoom. Okay. Oops. Let me go ahead. You know what? I'm going to get this figured out. You guys keep talking.
Just to kind of add a little bit to that, one thing I used to always tell my teachers as a principal, and I became a principal really young. I was 24. I was a little raw. I was more rapper than principal when I became principal. I didn't mention that earlier. I'm a hip hop artist too. And it's always been socially aware, social justice oriented music. But one thing that I kind of just realized before I even had the language when I became a principal was like, nothing is going to change without a shift in power, period. And it's up to us as leaders to help people tap into that innate moral responsibility, that moral compass, that if we're going to do this work, we got to believe that the majority have it in them, if not all, right? They have it in there. We have to help them uncover that and, and kind of ease the tension and more be focused on like, I have to do this work, this CRT work, because it's an extension of my values, right? That even just baseline, I want to be a human being that treats others with respect and love. Well, boom, sometimes we got to go back to the core basic and build off of that. Especially when leading with resistance. And I remember my first year as a principal, I was doing all sorts of, because I was in grad school, I was emergency certified. So I was in grad school at night, 2 nights a week while I was principal. And so I was taking the culturally responsive leadership courses while I was already in the hot seat. So I was coming back and immediately administering the surveys or whatever, whereas most of my peers in class were teachers or teacher leaders or something. I was actually already in the hot seat. So I would take all the feedback and they'd be like, all right, I go try it out. Tell us how it goes. And I would hear mumbling and grumblings in the hallway and they wouldn't know I was around. And, it's definitely, no pain, no gain type of work, but it's more rewarding than anything, right? To be able to have that heart-to-heart conversation with a teacher and maybe they start seeing things from a different lens and therefore their classroom culture and environment starts changing. And a lot of those conversations I had like I said, back then, I didn't really have the language that I do now, but I rooted it in just this idea that like the results we've been getting at this school are not that great. And it's even worse when you start breaking down the data and looking at different, diverse groups. And so, we kind of came to this consensus, there's no shift in power without a relinquishing of power, right? That doesn't mean your whole life got to be turned upside down, but that might be your resources. That's a little bit of that's something that could be used to further your power agenda, right? But maybe you're going to use some of your resources to change the trajectory for somebody else. Maybe it's your time. Maybe it's your knowledge, your skills. There's a lot of different ways, but thinking about this resistance is like taking me back to some that I experienced as a young principal, and really just, is getting me fired up to think about that again. Like, look, that's the reality we're dealing with. Joquetta touched on it. Dr. Tiffany touched on it, but like nothing changes without this shift in power, right? So part of our job is, first of all, looking at our own selves. Where can I relinquish some power, right? And be a little more selfless and more of a servant. And then how can I encourage and motivate others to take a similar, I don't want to say perspective, because I think we're in agreement. We're banishing that word, but like to take a similar stance. Did I buy you enough time, Melody?
It did. I love it. And I'm thinking of path. And I love everything that you're saying. I have learned so much. This is our fourth time. I keep learning more. And I want to say to that, I guess you guys have said, that, looking out for your safety. I have had the privilege to be able to be transformed, like Ike was saying, through like my spiritual journey. To be honest with you, I mean, that is what got me curious about it, because I started seeing inconsistency between what I believed. And I grew up in a very, very white evangelical culture, and racism was, we didn't talk about it. It was shooed under the rug because we were Christians. We weren't racist, of course. I mean, it was just assumed. But and that's why I didn't even realize the work that I had ahead of me. I truly didn't even understand and wasn't even cognizant of it until a few years ago. And so I'm going to just come from that perspective. I want you to know exactly how I started out. And thankfully, I've had the privilege to do this without having to fear for my safety. Now, I've had to make some personal sacrifices, but nothing where I thought I was in danger. And so the things that I talk about is the personal work, speaking up in real life scenarios. And I'm going to, so the things that definitely that are like major that I've had to go through when I'm trying to make sure that I'm always on the path that is not just for me, that I'm not looking out for myself, but actually giving up some of my power, letting others come up, letting go of that. I've had to definitely check my biases. I constantly have to do that. I still have to do that because I still get defensive at times, or I sometimes have to ask, am I doing this for my personal gain, or am I doing this for the greater good? Where's this coming from? And that is something, and I put these pictures to remind me, something that Ken Shelton brought to my attention. Ken Shelton's an amazing person to follow, and I do consider him a friend. I don't know if he considers me a friend, but I consider him a friend. But he brought spiritual bypassing. That's why I put this in this picture. If you have not Googled spiritual bypassing, and I feel like that is the biggest cover up for racism, especially for white people like me that have grown up in a very conservative evangelical atmosphere. We everything that is hurtful, we put under spiritual bypassing, whether it's about forgiveness, whether it's about, abuse in the church, whether it's racism, we put it under this blanket. And the more that I learn about spiritual bypassing, the more I realize why we have allowed ourselves to stay blind to the realities of abuse that we are putting on people. And I just wanted to put this little picture of this person alone. I feel like that is probably the biggest challenge I have had to face, because as I've gone on this journey, I have lost a ton of friends. I have lost best friends, close friends that I always took it for granted that I would always have. And it is especially, like I said, in this spiritual bypassing, because once you start questioning, why can't we talk about this? People will drop you. You make them feel uncomfortable. It's easier to stay in your own thoughts and not have to give up anything. And people don't want you to push them, and they will drop you. I I am not close with many of my family members anymore because everything is politicized. It is, we have lost our humanity over this. And now it's because, I have my own labels now. You're not this way, you're this way. So I just wanted to, if anything, look up spiritual bypassing. There's lots of sources out there. And when we're on this journey, self-reflection never stops. When I was starting to finally figure out that I indeed am racist, that I do have racist tendencies, no matter how good of a person I am, I have also perpetuated many white centralized ideas into my students. I've always been a great teacher. I've always had deep relationships, but I always have this path to be better. Like, I was never the greatest. I've always had to keep learning and growing out of that because I have done wrong things. We talk about white guilt. It is a thing, and you can either cry about it, you can ignore it, cry about it, or you can do something about it. And some of the things that I ask myself constantly, why am I feeling defensive? Am I agreeing with, like, what we were talking about earlier, all these news sources? Who am I agreeing with, and who is agreeing with me? One day I looked at, like, I'm a social media warrior, and I started to look at who is agreeing with me. It is only white people. I used to think that I was right all the time because all my white friends agreed with me. So of course I'm right. How could anybody else be, tell me I'm wrong? Look at all these people agreeing with me. And I'm one of those terrible people that looks at the comments on, like, social media, like, what are people saying? And I used to actually comment, but now I just want to see their reactions because I just want to see how people are thinking. And when you're behind a keyboard, people, they just put what they really think out there. They don't even try to cover up. They feel so brave. So I constantly am looking at that. And while social media is great, it's the same thing that is happening in front of you. And a lot of times what people are writing on social media is what they're too afraid to say out loud. But it really shows where they are. And I think it really shows where we are as a nation and as a global community. And I have to say, what are you learning from others? That is that is where I constantly, what am I learning? What am I learning? How can I go further? And I'm trying to talk fast because I don't want to say too much, but another thing is, why are we speaking up? We've talked about why. When are we speaking up? There are times where I feel like it is not my place to say anything. It is my place as a white person, a person who was born into a lot of privilege, that didn't ever have to question which option I was going to check on any of those sheets. I never felt like, oh, I don't belong here. Yes, I've always had the box. It never occurred to me that other people struggled with that. There are times when it's just your time to listen, and to say anything is kind of like a slap in the face. Like, let's use our platforms, let's use our words, whatever they are, whether it's a blog, whether it's social media, whether it's conversations that you're having in a group of people, especially an affinity group where you are a white person or somebody assumes that you are just like them. That has been the biggest eye-opening. People assume things about me. And I'm like, actually, and then I have to speak up. And when we were planning this, I brought up a good thing. It's like, how do you speak up, and are you going to be ready to speak up? And that's why all of this personal reflection and this journey means so much. There are times when you do have to stand up, and there are times when you just have to support those who really need the platform. We haven't really given it to them, but we need to lift those up. And so learning that difference has definitely been monumental for me. Now, when we talk about racism and equity, it doesn't always look the same. Like, you're not going to see the N-word everywhere you go, but it is there. And I loved the community that I taught in for years, but there were so many things wrong. And for a long time, I didn't know how to speak up. And for a long time, I was perpetuating it. So real life scenarios, this is one that has meant so much to me. And I have 3 scenarios, and I'm going to go through them kind of quickly. And then if we want to talk about them, I would love to talk about them, but I don't want to say too much. One of the things that I think is rampant. So when I went back to work after taking about 3 years off, I had kids and everything. I was introduced to a Muslim coworker, and for whatever reason, she and I did not hit it off at all. A lot of people told me, in our colleagues, they did not like her. They told me everything they did not like about her. So when I first met her, I already had a slew of opinions from others, and I already knew what I felt about Muslim people. And I had my own prejudices that at that point I had not even tried to disseminate. So through the course of this year, this is a true story, we butted heads, we had angry words, and our students were seeing it all. Now, our administrators The only time they stepped in was when a parent called and said, why did Mrs. McAllister shut the door on, this other teacher? And why is this other teacher always coming into Mrs. McAllister's lessons and interrupting? I mean, these are actual real things. What does that look like? So these are real life scenarios that it affects our students, and it's stemming from our personal belief systems. And so I want to think about that. I could tell you how it all played out. But I think it's just something to think about. Something else that is a real life scenario. I had a coworker. She was white, and every single year she would drag multiple times a year. She was always dragging around a student, loudly complaining about this student, and this student was always a Black male student, and she taught kindergarten. Okay, this is this child's first idea of school, and this is what is happening. And when it first started happening, I was so upset, but I didn't know how to deal with it at all. But it was like happening. I did report it to our administration, but it was still happening. Why is this happening? And one day, it was my turn. She came directly to me. It was not something that I could not face anymore. And I think that this happens when you see teachers kicking out students. Now, it's illegal in the district that I used to teach in, but it wasn't for a long time. Who are the students that are being kicked out or sitting in the hallways by themselves? For the campus that I taught in, it was always Black students, and it was usually the Black male students. So this is something that is happening. And another thing, and I'm only offering these so that we can talk about it. And the last thing that happened to me when I was really thinking about the impacts that you can make as an educator, my principal, and I use everything in my power to make a difference in these different scenarios. My principal finally asked me, like, I want you to sit in on interviews. I want you to sit in with who I'm going to hire. It was like a whole dialogue. And so this is where we're talking about giving up something. 80% of the teachers in my school, maybe more, to be honest, were all white. Our students were not all white, and we were very diverse. We had diversity in religion. We had diversity in ethnicity. We had diversity in race, and it was a beautiful, beautiful campus, okay? And I'm so blessed to have taught in there. So what am I going to do? Am I going to make sure, I prayed hard. Oh, I don't even want to say what I did, but I want us to think about these real life scenarios, because I think that we can have an impact in each one of these. And so I'm going to just kind of shut up for a second, and I probably shouldn't use that word, but I say it too much and I apologize. But I would love to be able to talk about this with anybody in the panel, and I can go back and forth if there's one that you want to talk about. And I'm going to look at the comments also.
So are you asking how would people deal with these situations?
Yeah, is there one that you want to specifically address? I mean, I can talk about how I personally dealt with all of them, but I don't know that I need to keep talking. Like, I'd love to hear from other people, but I am totally fine to talk about what the thought process is. These were personal. And when you think about, and this is, a lot of people that are listening to us today that are actually here, I feel like they are already doing a lot of incredible work. So this is almost for people that are, watching the replay for this, that may not know, like, how would I deal with this? Because the racism and the equity issues, they are not always super blatant. Like, you have to look at them and see them. When I was first teaching, I didn't see all of this as it is. It took years for me to understand the depth and the root and the destruction that was happening in front of me that didn't seem odd at first, if that makes any sense.
That makes complete sense. And I think it's one of those things where, because these scenarios are really, really happening, right, in real life, no matter what race or gender or ethnicity or sexual orientation or physical ability or, all of the different things that make us a wonderful, wonderful society. Looking at these is really nice to kind of sit with and think with, because it's leading us into our last topic, which is, how do you become an ally, advocate, and activist, right? Because that's really what you're starting to get at, is how can we start looking at these scenarios and helping, right? Especially whether they deal with us directly or not, they deal with us directly, right? It's like one of those things where no matter what we think, it is affecting us. So when we're looking at these real life scenarios and thinking about how to become an ally, activist, and advocate, I want to ask that question leading into your scenarios where people can really think about it, and just open it up to the panel of what is the difference between an ally, activist, and advocate? And Melody has shared these on the resource sheet. So you can get to those on the resource sheet.
Before we move, I just want to say that, Melanie, I always appreciate and love your vulnerability and your willingness to speak your truth in your personal journey, right? Because and share like all of the mistakes and hiccups, because it is a journey, right? And so I just want to thank you for being vulnerable enough to share it and call it out, the things that have happened, because that's hard. And that push, and you have to be very vulnerable and knowing that it's an ongoing journey. So I just want to thank you for speaking your truth and always being willing to be vulnerable and sharing that. And as a Black female, I just want to say as well to my people out there, the people of color, don't think that because I'm a person of color that I cannot also have not been indoctrinated by dominant culture, that I'm not pushing those beliefs onto my students and that I can't cause harm either. Because, and I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, like when you place all those scenarios up, I think at some point, like it's not always blatant. Like we talk about race and inequity, it doesn't mean that somebody's necessarily now walking with the hood and all that other things. There are some things that we can do. I just did a presentation called Good People Have Bias Too. And I think they may be called Good Racist People. I can't remember, but nevertheless, that inherently, as Ike said, we're good people, right? And that the biases that we have does not make us bad people, but we have to recognize that we have these biases, and a lot of that comes from social construction, from media, our lived experiences, like you said, and it does tie into like we have to give up some things, right, to do this work. And I think like when we talk about the allies and the advocates and those things, like that allies, that person who's there, who's working along with me, sometimes people, you have to figure out where you are in this journey as well to decide where you want to be, right? And so I think that is so critical when we talk about doing this work, and it really does. And I just keep going back to just reiterating that it really does start with self and recognize, because sometimes we have to be willing to also recognize and say out loud what we have done and continue to do the mistakes we're continuing to make. So you may be that teacher who is not even recognizing that, hey, why am I often putting that kid out of the classroom, the Black kid? Or why am I often the student who's the English language learner, I'm not picking on that student in the classroom to participate? You have to look at that and unpack that and ask yourself those questions. And I think that is key to this work. So I just wanted to just personally say that. Thank you for sharing those pieces.
Yeah, and Mel, I feel the exact same way. I think for you, you make it, you always say you're the learner, but I think you make it easier for us to be able to be equally honest and vulnerable. And to Jaquetta's point, not only can we be equally guilty, I think we also have to, again, it comes down to study, because privilege takes so many different forms. Yes, white privilege exists and it is real, but I also understand as a lighter complected, educated woman, I have a certain privilege that others in my family don't operate or walk in, or just by being a woman, or just by being educated, or by being in a certain community. So, when you talk about your experiences, all of our lived experiences, in Emden's book, he says for white folks who teach in the hood, and the part I always highlight is, and for the rest of y'all, because he's talking about us, those of us who have forgotten, why did we come into education? And recently just heard one of our chiefs make the statement that when you're doing the work you're doing for children, you have to remember one thing. Whatever your wardrobe is that you've chosen, that luxury, that comfort, the nice home, the car, whatever it is that you have that makes your life easier, you've done that, you've acquired that, you've earned that, if you will, on the backs of somebody else's children. And for me, what resonates is when you say on the backs of someone else's children, the only thing that comes to my mind so clearly and matter of factly is, what does slavery look like? We built a country on the back of a people. And that's why this becomes a personal journey and moratorium. And to the point of losing people, sometimes you got to do the assessment and you realize that it was dead weight in the first place.
Dead
Mars.
weight in the first place.
I love it. And this all helps us segue into how we want to wrap up, looking a little more in depth at allies, advocates, and activists. And these are words that can be used interchangeably, but we wanted to kind of leave you kind of with the framework to start really dissecting where you fit in, right? So we understand that they could kind of be used interchangeably, but we're trying to segment them out a little bit so that you can kind of see where you're where you're at the journey and how you can continue to grow and have the biggest impact. And I think, you know, from the scenarios that Melody shared, I think we can agree if we put ourselves in the role of the kid, the kindergarten, young Black kid being dragged through the campus and paraded and complained about, if we could put ourselves in his shoes or in his parents' or family shoes, I think we would all agree this. Oh, there we go. I think we can agree that it's an emergency and we need some roadside assistance, right? So we got the AAA coming in, the ally, the advocate, and the activist. Okay, now the thing is, if you're not ready to come in with as an activist, that's okay. That's why we kind of want to share. We wanted to segment them a little bit, even though they're used interchangeably, so we can really start honing in on where we're at, because we don't want you to jump into a scenario you don't feel comfortable or ready for yet. You can start doing the work without being on the front line in a you know, leading a rally on the bullhorn day one, right? So let's kind of dissect it a little bit and hopefully leave here with some tips on how we can provide some emergency services. So I'm going to go kind of quickly for time. So feel free to comment in the chat if you need me to hold a slide a little bit longer or anything like that. But an ally, just looking at the pure definition, is someone who makes the commitment and effort to recognize their privilege, whether that's gender, race, class, sexual identity, etc., and work with oppressed groups in the struggle for justice. That's why we started with ally as the first A. It's kind of like the starting point. We're just committing, hey, I don't like what I'm seeing. I'm committed to this, right? And so an ally understands that it's in their own interest to end all forms of oppression, even those from which we might benefit, right? If we're going to be an ally, we got to understand there's going to have to be some type of exchange to swing the pendulum the other way in the benefit of those who have been oppressed. Another commitment from allies is that we got to commit to reducing our own complicity or collusion in oppression of those groups. That's why, again, to echo others, what the praise they shared with Melody, it takes a lot of vulnerability and a lot of courage to be that transparent and share where we've fallen short on this journey. But that's part, you know, I think Jaquetta said it, if you can't name it, you can't fix it. And that goes for our own biases, our own mess ups in the past. And you know, that's very important that we do that as part of the journey. Now, the way this is going to work, after I tell you kind of the definition of ally, advocate, activist, I'm going to share some tips with you. But I also want to pose a question really quickly. In just 60 seconds in the chat, what do you think is the first step in becoming an ally? And you can pull from the definition, you can kind of pull from your own thoughts. This is kind of a broad term. There's not one specific definition for it, but feel free to share. What do you think is the first step in becoming an ally? And then I'll share kind of from my viewpoint some tips to get started. Now I'm going to take a quick look at the chat. Being intentional, recognize your own bias, ongoing critical self-reflection is crucial, personal reflection, all of these, waking up and seeing what is happening to others. Awesome. I'll give you about 15 more seconds. Be open to listening to others. Be at peace with yourself. I like that you said that, Asma, and I hope I said your name right, because look, we are who we are, right? And you got to start with the clay that you are right now. You know, the good news is we can mold it, but you can't change the clay out, right? That you are what you are, and what we can do is mold it and finesse it and grow as individuals, seeing yourself in the oppression of others, having that empathy, yes, wondering what if it were you. I love that, because it's such a simple thought, but it's really the answer to everything. Would I want to be that kid, or would I want that to be my child? When we look at everything like that, changes the weight of all of it, right? You are a masterpiece and work in progress at the same time. Amen to that. Awesome. So I'll share a little bit, kind of just some of my own thoughts and suggestions around being an ally. So first steps, we kind of started taking them today, and I encourage you to dive deeper. We got to have a strong vocabulary to help navigate this work. Again, we can't name it, we can't fix it. So I put a link there, and we'll make sure the resource gets shared, but it's got a pretty lengthy list of terms related to this equity work, whether it's critical race theory, racism, anti-racism, white privilege, white fragility. There's a lot of definitions in there, ethnicity, race, et cetera, in there that I encourage all of you to look at. Because once we have that language, we can have more robust conversations around what it means to be an ally. Number two, I love that we've already kind of started on this journey too. We have to develop a strong sense of our own identity. And we've all touched on this a couple times throughout our session today. But if we don't know what our own values, our own biases and blind spots are, then, you know, it's kind of like the blind leading the blind, right? So we want to do a deep dive on this. Now, the beauty of this part is you can do this in the comfort of your home, right? This is reflecting. This is having your tea or your cup of coffee and journaling and thinking about what are your values? Why did I get into education? What are some potential biases? You're here, so, you know, I don't want to assume, but at least after today's session, you're already probably thinking of some things that you might not have been. Journal those out. Two things that I suggest as you kind of go on this path of really doing a deep dive on your own identity is the cultural iceberg. And I'll show you an image of it in just a second. But I recommend you just look at that cultural iceberg and start writing it out. Starting at the surface. What do I celebrate? What kind of music do I listen to? What holidays are important to my family? And then diving deeper. What are my beliefs about parenting, about time, about work ethic? And so I'll show you that image in just a second. But for low-hanging fruit, if you do anything related to this ally work, I suggest you start there with the cultural iceberg. And then it's a great activity to do with your students too. And then, of course, implicit bias, right? If we want to uncover our biases, a great starting point is doing this implicit bias test from Harvard. That link is up. You can click the link and take the test yourself. And so, and then I think the third piece, 2 and 3 kind of go together, but that fourth bullet piece is important too, as we get started in the work. Self-educate about different identity groups and about how others experience oppression. At this point, there's no shortage of knowledge, right? And we'll share some books in a second that we recommend, but there's not a lack of knowledge. So we just have to prioritize it, right? And start, you don't got to get all 5 books or 7 books or whatever. Pick a book and get started on understanding the journey of other folks. Even if you're part of that oppressed group, it doesn't hurt to learn as well, because you might discover some things that explain some of the things that you've encountered or experienced. And now you have the language to help others navigate that too. So that's kind of how we're viewing the ally. You can see it's not a lot of action outside of the self yet. The ally, we're kind of viewing it as, are you committed to this work? And there's the cultural iceberg that we'll make sure you got. And again, I just recommend you go through there and journal out for each of those. What are my values, my religious beliefs, body language that I respect or don't respect, expectations, etc. Now, moving on to advocate. Once we've committed to being an ally, we do a deep dive on ourselves. An advocate is really a person who publicly supports or recommends a particular cause or policy. Now, I want to leave you with this question. You don't have to answer it now for time's sake, but I want you to leave here and think about what are some ways and or things you can advocate for in your current role, right? I heard a great sermon this past Sunday, and the pastor was just talking about how we should live in outside in the real world and according to our beliefs. And he said, I can see people in the audience getting stressed out like I'm about to throw more on your plate. He said, no, look at your current role. What can you do differently in your current role to be an advocate? We're not talking about, oh, now on set, you got to spend your whole Saturday doing X, Y, Z now. Start in your home and start in your classroom. If you're a teacher, if you're a principal, start in your school and just look at things you can advocate for in your current role. And so I want to leave you with that question, but I want to share some examples. The low-hanging fruit here is, how about we proactively build relationships with people who are different than us, right? A genuine intent here to just learn from others, and not just learn from them. We're not using them. I want to build a relationship with people who are different from me. And I know a fruit of that is going to be that I learn a lot, right? Because they're not going to always agree with me. We might share differences, etc. And this doesn't have to just be work related. You could start with your neighbor if they're different, right? Or, I mean, all your neighbors are different, even if they look like you. That's the beauty of diversity. So even if you just invite your neighbors over for dinner, I want to encourage you to start thinking of things like this. Same with colleagues, students, and parents. And again, don't necessarily be prying and asking questions. And, if you got if it's a Black friend or a Muslim friend, don't be trying to use them to get all the information you want. Just lean in, listen, and if the learning happens, it happens. But we want to go in with the mentality that I truly want to build a relationship and partnership. And I know naturally I'm going to learn from that. If you're in the school setting, you can ask about plans to address the opportunity gaps, state testing scores, graduation rates, disciplinary rates, etc. You can ask about a more inclusive curriculum. You can do things like vote locally for those who prioritize racial justice or social justice. You can support businesses owned by people that look different from you or people of color. You can boycott things that clearly don't support the oppressed groups that you're trying to be an advocate for. You can also donate. A lot of us get busy sometimes, but there are people on the front lines doing the work every day, and you can donate to those organizations and help them carry out the work, right? So that brings us to activists. So ally, we're committing to the work. Advocate, we're starting to use our mouthpiece a little bit now. We're starting to stand up for things. Hey, what are we doing about this? What are we doing about that? Activists, we really see is you've done your homework, and now you're really someone who's ready to campaign to bring about this political or social change, right? And there's a major key there. I don't know if you guys listen to DJ Khaled at all, but he always has those major keys. And so the major key here is activists remain aware of their community and their community's needs, right? So we're escalating a little up from just being an ally and doing a deep dive on ourselves, from speaking up in the meeting occasionally for what we think is right. But now we're really making an effort to be in tune with the community we are a part of and the needs of that community. And activist recognizes that social justice isn't a cause that has an end. And we've kind of preached that throughout today. This is a journey, right? And but activism is a medium that keeps accountability and this justice progressing forward. So again, for time, you don't have to do it in the chat, but I want you to leave with this question in mind. So 2 questions, right? Or three assignments for you. Do the deep dive using the cultural iceberg framework and just journal that out. Get to know yourself better. Number 2, think about current things in your current role that you could advocate for, whether it's specific student groups, resources, supports, etc. And then 3, I want to encourage you to imagine, what would it look like if you became an activist in your community? We got to be able to visualize it before we execute on it. And I'm going to be honest, and kind of prepping this, I was like, I like to think of myself an activist. Right now, I'm an advocate. and this is motivating me to flip that switch back on and get back on the front lines in more ways than I currently am, and really be an activist for the groups who need, that support. And so here's kind of a little framework. I know we're right at time that I wanted to leave you with in terms of, as you start imagining, man, Heidi, Gail, Abigail, as you picture the activist version of yourself, here's just kind of some tips for starting in the activist work. First of all, substantiate a problem's existence. A lot of times we kind of know something's wrong, but we can't pin it down. We got to do that work, whether it's looking at data, talking to people who are dealing with the issue and on the oppressive side of things, and really trying to learn so that we can get the data and that we need to tell that story appropriately. Once we do that, we got to translate that to relevancy, right? Like, what is this? Who is this data going to help? And why is it important that I share this data, right? Now, we always want to be solution oriented. Nobody likes a complainer. So if we're going to engage in this activist work, we got to identify solutions or at least start brainstorming them. And then the last one, we got to mobilize action, right? I heard a great thing when I was in principal training through KIP's principal prep program. And the CEO said, visionaries are overrated. And that stuck with me because I always used to say like, oh, I'm a visionary. I see it. He was like, nah, visionary is overrated. What does the day-to-day look like? So I just want to encourage you guys to kind of use that as a simple framework to even start thinking about, activism, finding the problem. Why is it relevant? Who's it going to help? Start brainstorming solutions and then get to work. And I say get to work. I didn't say have the perfect plan and then get to work, right? Have a plan, but then get to work and revise as you go. All right. Now I'm gonna stop there.
That was awesome because I always hear the three words, ally, advocate, activist. And I'm like, well, they mean different things. We should not be using them interchangeably. They mean different things. So thank you for breaking it down, Ike. That was awesome. And how I want to kind of wrap us up here is for each of the panelists to kind of sum it up in, about a minute or less and answer, why is equity not an add-on? Why is this important? Why is this not just another thing that I have to deal with or another thing that I have to worry about? Why is equity not an add-on? Or how can they start being an ally, advocate, or activist? So whichever one you want to pinpoint, but about a 1 minute wrap up of your final thoughts. Joquetta? Oh, go ahead, Dr. Tiffany.
No. I'll say this, and it's something that I've said in training teachers the last few weeks. It's simple. Abraham Lincoln said that the philosophy of the classroom in one generation would be the philosophy of government in the next. So if we look out at government, what we're dealing with, what we're seeing, what we find is that much of what we thought was behind us has only been beside us in the shadows. Social media, cameras have reminded us that it never stopped, it never ended. So when I think of it not being an add-on, it's because it's not an option, because the future of humanity, not a race, but the future of humanity is dependent upon what we do now.
And I would add on to that, yes. And if you see it as an add-on, then you see it as a technical solution, and it's a matter of a couple of checking boxes. And that's not what it is. You really have to embody this. And the way to begin is starting with that critical self-reflection. We have given you a plethora of tools, from Ike's amazing breakdown of ally, to advocate, to Melanie when she talked about seeing the scenarios, but critical self-reflection. It's not a technical solution. It's a way of being.
Melody?
Sure. Sorry. It's just sometimes what you do is what helps other people start. Like Dr. Tiffany said, it is here. Like we can deal with this for the next 200 years, or we can actually make real changes so that we can grow from where we have been. It just looks different, but it's here until we deal with it. And sometimes we are the people that spark other people to question everything. And that's my purpose. And I thank you again for having me. Y'all are so amazing. Everybody that came today, everybody that spoke, you've taught.
Ike?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many wonderful things to echo, but I'll say from doing that. I think the main thing that I have to echo is Tiffany hit it on the head. This is for the sake of humanity, right? Like, now, that doesn't mean it should bog you down. The weight of that shouldn't bog you down to inaction, right? Or analysis paralysis. But when we're lacking that motivation, when we're, not feeling like doing the work or having the tough conversation or reading that book or self-reflecting, we do got to go back to that, right? And think about the student in Melody's scenario, or, think about the weight of the statement that this is really, we're impacting humanity through this work. Right. And saving it in a lot of ways from ourselves and old teachings and old biases and things that so many of us, really that all of us still carry to this day. So, I encourage everybody to see it as a thread that should flow through all of the work, right? Whether we're talking about instruction, policy, behavior plans, even our homes. Right. So thank you guys for showing up, and just want to encourage you to stay on this journey and to keep putting up the good fight.
And I will say that it's not an add-on because it's not an add-on. It is life. And it is affecting all of humanity. And it's one of those things where if you think you can ignore it, you will quickly learn that you cannot. And then you're going to be heartbroken. So instead of trying to ignore it and thinking that it doesn't affect my life, it does, and it will, because it's going to either affect us now or it's going to affect us later. And we've been dealing with this for how many millions and, how many years have we been dealing with this, and we're continuing to deal with it. And it's a shameful thing that we're continuing to deal with it, right? We should feel that shame, but that shame should move us to action. And I want us to kind of watch a couple of things. So when you do start becoming an ally, an activist, or an ally, an advocate, or an activist, please listen to the people that you're fighting for. You can't tell people to shut up and then fight for them. So if you're fighting for any certain group of people, listen to them when they tell you that what you just did was not okay, or that, what you did, you need to rethink what you just said. Listen to the people that you're actually trying to help. And please watch the toxic positivity. Yes, kindness is everything. I completely agree with that. But, one of the things I put on Twitter a while ago is you can't tell our students to kill them with kindness when they're being killed with bullets. That doesn't equate. So it's just one of those things that you have to watch that toxic positivity and, do the best you can. Start now. Let the shame go. Start now and do better and be better. That's what we all want. And I'm not talking to any group of people. That's all of us. Do better, learn better, be better. So we're going to end right now. Thank you so very much to the entire panel. This was, I feel like every time we have a set time, it could be longer. Like we have an hour, we're like, we need 2 hours. We have 2 hours, like now we could do 3 hours. It can always be longer. And that's because that kind of shows you too that it is a continuous conversation. It's not something that you just be like, oh, I'm done. I had a webinar from the panel. I'm done now. No, we're never done, right? And thank you, Dr. Tiffany, for putting, I always talk about BDA. How does your bias determine your actions? And that's one of my major things. But thank you so much. So if the panel doesn't mind, and I'm kind of just throwing this out there, but if the panel doesn't mind, I did make it to where the participants who are left can unmute themselves. So if you would like to ask a very quick question to the panel, if anyone on the panel has to leave, I absolutely understand because we're already 10 minutes over. So please just duck out. Thank you so very much for doing this. But if anybody has a question that they would like to come on the mic to ask, this is kind of first and last call. If you would like to come on the mic and ask a question.
Hi guys, thank you again for this wonderful meeting. You're always adding to my experience. Thank you for being my voice in far distance, because we are reading the same page no matter what we are, where we are. There's millions of kilometers between us, but the good thing is that we are reading the same page. We are completing each other. And if there's any chance we can repeat such a meeting again after maybe first quarter, so we can bring examples from real life, because here in Kuwait, we are ready to accept the kids back to school. And I'm sure that I will have lots of things to share with you, and I will ask you for your opinions, because your kids started earlier than our kids. And it's a challenge thing for us. We do have kids with different backgrounds now, with more pain, and they would like us to listen to them more than educating them, because they are running from the screen, from being held at home, from parents not listening. So this kind of a new challenge, I'm telling all my colleagues, guys, the first quarter is to teach the kids how to sit behind a chair, behind the table, and listen and raise their hands. It's like teaching them the basics from the beginning, and then care about the subject, care about the syllabus, care about testing them or giving them summative. So I really need to have your experience from that, because it will help me to be a much better teacher for my kids. Especially I'm teaching Arabic as a second language, and that's a complete challenge for me. Thank you again.
You're so very welcome. And I do agree with that. You know, you have to teach your students the basic skills, you know, before you can get into content. You have to teach the student themselves before you get into content. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so I think we will go ahead and wrap this up. Again, Joquetta, Tiffany, Melody, thank y'all so much for being on this panel and for sharing your time, of course, for free, and putting together presentations and just doing all the stuff that you did. Thank you so very much. Ike, I did want to ask you, is that the presentation that you did, is that on the resource list?
No, that's why I just sent it to you.
Okay, so
I got that link in my email though. If I can go add it personally myself.
okay, so we will, however it gets there, we'll add that to the resource list. So you can have the questions and you'll have the links that he shared with you. Thank you so much. But thank you to everyone. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Tiffany.
No, I was just gonna say, I've been updating the resource list as we've been going through. So book titles and topics, I've even put the cultural iceberg activity as well as Ike's image. So it's already there for you to see, just things that you can go back and reference, because it is so much and it's always ongoing. So hopefully this is not meant for you to do all of this, but to both Joquetta and Ike's point, starting somewhere. You're going to start somewhere.
Okay, well, thank you to everyone. And the evaluation is in the chat, so you can go ahead and do the evaluation. And again, thank you to the amazing panel.